Pull your chair a little closer to the fire tonight, dear friends. I want to tell you about the Bellwood Harvest Assembly of 1887, and what happened when an entire county decided, before a single word was spoken, that Miss Margot Sinclair had no choice at all. She was poor. Lord Everett Bourne was not, and in the quiet arithmetic of polite society, those two facts together were considered answer enough. Now, before I go any further, I should tell you the truth about Miss Sinclair, because the assembly hall certainly did not bother with it. She was 28 years old. She wore that evening a dress of deep green silk that had belonged to her aunt. The hem let down 3 inches, a small tear near the left sleeve concealed beneath a carefully placed brooch. No one looking pleasantly at her would have noticed. Everyone looking for evidence of poverty did. She stood near the tall windows of the Bellwood Assembly Hall, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that a room's cruelty travels faster than its music. Her father, Mr. Gordon Sinclair, had been dead 7 months. What he left behind was Sinclair Grange, 40 acres, an old mill house on Avon Creek, 2 younger sisters, and debts that arrived in the Morning Post like uninvited guests who never quite left. Margot knew most of them by name now. She had spent the better part of that autumn at her father's desk, opening drawers, reading letters, adding figures by candlelight until her fingers were cold. The largest debt, the one that mattered most, had been purchased some weeks prior by Lord Everett Bourne, Viscount of Ashwick. He was 36. He held 700 acres to the north, a seat in the county magistracy, and the kind of quiet authority that rooms adjusted themselves around without being asked. He was also, as of 3 weeks prior, the single largest creditor attached to Sinclair Grange. He had not explained why. When he crossed the assembly hall toward her that evening, the room shifted. Mothers leaned toward daughters. 2 gentlemen near the card tables lowered their voices. Lady Renwick, who was hosting, pressed both hands together beneath her chin, as though witnessing something long anticipated. "Lord Bourne is coming directly to you," said the woman, beside Margot, an older neighbor, with a particular gift for stating the obvious. "I can see that," Margot said. Lord Bourne bowed. He had a low, measured voice, the kind that rarely raised itself because it rarely needed to. "Miss Sinclair, you have been avoiding this side of the room all evening. I have been standing in this corner all evening. That is rather the opposite." Something moved across his face, amusement or perhaps calculation. He offered his arm. The orchestra was preparing a quadrille. "Will you dance?" Margot looked at his arm. She looked at the watching room behind him. "No, thank you." The woman beside her inhaled sharply. Lord Bourne did not lower his arm immediately. Then he said quietly, "I should like to speak with you privately." "Then speak." "Not here." "Yes, here." His jaw tightened. "You received my solicitor's notice." The notice requiring repayment of the full Sinclair debt within 60 days, or the Grange would be seized. Yes, she had read it 4 times. "I received it." "Then you understand why a private conversation." "I understand," Margot said. "Exactly why you prefer it private. That is why I prefer it public." Several heads turned. Lord Bourne looked around the room, and then, dear friends, the kind of decision that proud men sometimes make when they believe their position cannot be challenged. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "Miss Sinclair is right. There is no reason this should remain a private matter." The quadrille did not begin. Lord Bourne turned toward her fully. "For some months, I have admired Miss Sinclair's strength of character and her devotion to her family in the face of considerable hardship." A murmur of approval moved through the nearest rows. "I had hoped to speak with her father," he continued, "but his passing prevented it. Therefore, before our friends and neighbors, I ask Miss Margot Sinclair to do me the honor of becoming my wife." The room held its breath. "She's saved," someone whispered near the supper table. An elderly woman with a fan said, loudly enough to be heard across half the floor, "There, my dear, Providence has been very good to you." providence. As though a marriage proposal arrived like weather, something that happened to a person rather than something a person chose. Lord Bourne produced a ring, a sapphire, deep blue, ringed in small diamonds. He held it toward her with the quiet confidence of a man who had already calculated the outcome. Margot looked at the ring. She looked at the assembled room. The smiling faces, the relief disguised as affection. Not one person appeared to wonder whether she loved him. Not one person seemed to be asking whether she wanted this life. They saw only the numbers. Her father's debts, his title, her empty rooms, his full accounts. To them, this was not a question. It was arithmetic, and she was expected to make it balance. She looked back at Lord Bourne. "Did you purchase my father's debts before or after you decided to propose?" The room went still in a different way. Lord Bourne's expression did not change, but his eyes did, Miss Sinclair. "Answer me, please," she said. "Here before our friends and neighbours as you chose." A murmur moved through the assembly. Lord Bourne lowered the ring slightly. "This is not the appropriate. You made it appropriate. Did you acquire the Sinclair Mill mortgage because it was a sound investment?" Silence. "Or because controlling it would make my refusal difficult?" Lady Renwick made a small sound behind her fan. Lord Bourne stepped closer and lowered his voice to something meant only for Margot. "Your family faces a grave situation. I am offering security protection." "You are offering terms," Margot said. "There is a letter in my father's correspondence. Your solicitor writes that the Sinclair family will be considerably more reasonable once they understand the full extent of their exposure. I found it in the bottom drawer of my father's writing desk, beneath 7 months of unopened post. Not a letter of courtship, a strategy." Lord Bourne's face changed. She continued steadily. "I will not marry a man who purchased leverage over my family and called it protection." A glass shattered somewhere near the supper table. "You understand what refusal means," he said quietly. "What happens in 60 days? Yes, Sinclair Grange may be lost. Our name dragged through every county record office between here and Bristol. I know what refusal means, Lord Bourne." She looked at him directly. "I am choosing it anyway." The word had already crossed the room without effort. He closed his fingers around the ring. His expression was difficult to read. Anger, certainly, and beneath it something she might have named wounded, if she had been in a more forgiving mood. He bowed. "Not warmly, your answer has been heard. So has your proposal." She lifted the hem of her borrowed dress and walked to the doors. The crowd parted. No one tried to stop her. "Now, dear friends, I am going to pause here, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, she's going to lose everything. And you're wondering whether it was worth it. Stay with me. Because this is exactly the point where the story becomes considerably more interesting than anyone at that assembly had the imagination to suppose. And if you haven't yet found your way to Moonlight at Bellwood, this would be a fine moment to subscribe so you never miss a story. I have many more evenings like this one waiting. The fire is always lit. Now, where were we? Outside the hall, rain had started. Cold October rain that offers no apologies. Margot's hired carriage wasn't due for another hour. She walked. She had not gone half a mile before she heard wheels on the road behind her. Lord Bourne stepped out into the rain. His coat darkened at the shoulders immediately. He was not a man accustomed to standing in rain. He stood in it anyway. "You humiliated me," he said. She turned. "You proposed publicly because you believed public pressure would make refusal impossible. I simply declined to be the thing you were using it on. I expected you to understand what I was offering. I understood precisely. That is why I refused it." He was quiet. Rain ran from the brim of his hat. "Then, you have a younger sister, 2 of them." The words found their mark. Lily, 19, with the kind of brightness that deserved to come through this intact. And young Ada, 14, who still believed grief was something that eventually lifted. Both depend on you, he said. Your refusal tonight may cost them their home. I know that. Then, why? Because what you were offering would cost them something else. She met his eyes. A sister who surrendered her own life to circumstance rather than choosing it. That is not a lesson I am willing to teach them, regardless of the price. He had no answer for that. After a moment, I purchased the debt because I was afraid of who else would buy it. Your father's situation was known in certain circles. There were men who would have been far less patient than I intended to be. Intended, she noted the word. What changed the intention? He looked away. I wanted you to have reason to accept. So you manufactured one. She turned and continued walking. He did not follow. At Sinclair Grange, the front door opened before she could knock. Lily stood in the hall. Behind her, Ada held a candle. He proposed, said Ada. Margot removed her wet cloak, yes. And I refused. The candle shook. Lily sat down very slowly on the hall bench. You refused Lord Everett Bourne before people. Before the entire assembly. Neither sister spoke. Then Ada set down the candle and crossed the hall and put her arms around her sister. Lily joined a moment later. The three of them stood together in the dark, cold hall of their father's house, which might not be their house much longer, not pretending any of them had all the courage, only admitting they would look for some in the morning. The morning brought Mr. Abel Dodd. He was 71, walked with a cane, and had managed the Sinclair mill for 32 years before Margot's father had let him go the previous spring under circumstances that had never quite made sense to anyone who knew him. He stood at the door holding a wrapped bundle of papers. Miss Sinclair, I heard about last night. I thought you might want to see these. He had kept copies. Every year's mill accounting, every tenant payment receipt, every delivery record, for 4 years running. And when Margot laid them beside the official estate accounts that had accompanied her father's debts, the difference became visible within the hour. According to the official ledgers, the Sinclair mill had produced almost nothing for 3 years. According to Mr. Dodd's copies, it had produced quite a great deal, and the payments had gone somewhere other than the Sinclair accounts. Someone had been collecting the income and recording it as losses. Margot stared at the 2 sets of figures. Then, who administered these accounts after my father became ill? Mr. Dodd set his cane against the table. A man named Denzil Croft. He came recommended by Lord Bourne's solicitor's office. Your father trusted him on that basis. And what does Mr. Croft gain from a falsified ledger? Mr. Dodd removed a folded newspaper from inside his coat and opened it flat on the table. A proposed canal, the Avon Valley route. Parliament has been debating the bill for 18 months. He pointed to a survey map printed beside the article. The route crosses the Sinclair Eastern Fields, the mill property, and the Old Creek easement. If the bill passes, Miss Sinclair, that land becomes worth 4 or 5 times its current value, perhaps more. Margot sat down. Your father's income appeared to vanish, Mr. Dodd continued. He borrowed to cover it. He never understood that the income hadn't vanished. It had been redirected. And the man redirecting it needed the Grange to fail so it could be purchased cheaply, before anyone understood what the canal approval would mean. By whom? Denzil Croft. Through a company called Avon Valley Holdings, registered in Bristol. I have the registration papers as well. She looked at the mill receipts, at her father's signature on debts that should never have existed, at proof that the tenants had paid, that the money had been there all along, taken by a man her father had trusted. Did Lord Bourne know? I cannot say with certainty. But his own written instructions to Croft. I found a copy among the mill files, stated clearly that the Sinclair debt was not to be accelerated without his personal written approval. She examined the 60-day notice again. Lord Bourne's seal. But something about the impression around the wax was slightly misaligned. Someone had copied it. Lord Bourne arrived at the Grange at 11 o'clock. He stopped in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the papers covering the table. Then he looked at Mr. Dodd. "Why is he here?" he asked. "He came," Margot said, "with proof that the 60-day notice bearing your seal was not sent by you." Lord Bourne went very still. "I sent no 60-day notice." "Then look carefully at your own seal." She held it out. He read it. His face changed, not dramatically, but with the focused stillness of a man who has just understood something that reorders everything else around it. "Croft," he said. Mr. Dodd laid out the mill ledgers beside the official accounts. Lord Bourne read them page by page, in silence. When he finished, he said, "The canal route." Yes. He wanted the mill rights and the eastern easement, and falsified 3 years of income to create a debt your money could purchase. You provided the capital and the credibility. He provided the mechanism. I didn't know about the rents. "I believe you," Margot said. Then carefully, "I believe you about that." He heard the distinction. He accepted it without argument. "Croft will have the original ledgers," Lord Bourne said. "If we can reach them before he realizes what we've found, he will already know. He'll have had someone watching last night. Then he'll move them, or destroy them." Lord Bourne picked up his hat. "I know where Croft keeps his private files. He uses the old Bourne estate office in town. I gave him access 3 years ago to consolidate the trust records." He looked at her. It was not quite asking permission, not quite giving an order. Something in between, which was, under the circumstances, a considerable improvement. They went together. The file drawers had been emptied in haste. Croft had been there and gone, but he had not finished. Lord Bourne found the Avon Valley Holdings registry papers in a locked cabinet. Margot found a correspondence file behind a false panel she located because she had grown up in an old estate house and knew where such things were hidden. Inside, 4 years of letters between Croft and a Bristol solicitor detailing every step. The falsified accounts, the redirected rents, the canal survey results, known privately for 8 months before being made public, the instructions for using the Sinclair debt to force a sale below true value, and a single letter from Lord Bourne, dated before any of it began, instructing Croft in plain language that the Sinclair accounts were not to be touched without explicit written approval. He looked at his own signature for a long moment. Then he put the letter in the case with the rest of the evidence. The constable arrived before noon. Croft was found at a Bristol coaching inn 2 days later, which was, as I have always found, the characteristic failure of men who believe themselves cleverer than everyone around them. They run, but not quite far enough. The legal proceedings lasted 6 weeks. Lord Bourne filed to dissolve Avon Valley Holdings. Margot filed to have the Sinclair debt recalculated against the actual mill income, which, with the stolen rents restored, reduced the legitimate figure to a fraction of what had been claimed. At the hearing, Lord Bourne's barrister prepared a careful statement. Lord Bourne set it aside. He told the court that he had purchased the Sinclair mortgage partly from genuine concern about harsher creditors, and partly because he had believed Miss Sinclair's dependence on him would make his proposal more likely to succeed. The courtroom went quiet. He said, "I understand that to be an improper use of another person's financial circumstances. I did not understand it clearly at the time. I do now." Margot sat in the public gallery beside Mr. Dodd. She watched Lord Bourne on the stand and thought about what it cost a man like that. A man who had arranged everything so carefully, to stand in a public room and admit that the arrangement had been dishonest. He did not look toward her while he said it. He was not confessing for her reaction. He was giving the court the whole truth, including the part that reflected most poorly on himself. The judge granted the injunction. The fraudulent debt was set aside. Croft was convicted of embezzlement and forgery. Avon Valley Holdings was dissolved. The Sinclair mill rights and eastern easement entered the county record as Sinclair property, which meant that when the Canal Bill passed Parliament 3 months later and the land value rose almost overnight, it rose for the Sinclairs. The bank offered refinancing the following week. Sinclair Grange was safe. Lily took over the household accounts and discovered she had a talent for numbers that no one, including Lily herself, had previously suspected. Ada established a small lending library in the old morning room, mostly for the children of the mill tenants, which outgrew its shelves within a year and a half. Mr. Abel Dodd returned as estate manager. His portrait was eventually hung in the mill office. He found this acutely embarrassing and said so at every opportunity. Lord Bourne spent the following months reorganizing the Bourne estate entirely. He published the accounts. He appointed independent trustees. He wrote, and I find this detail telling, a formal record of the Sinclair affair, including his own conduct from the beginning, and had it filed in the Bourne Estate Archive so that future administrators would know exactly how the situation had arisen and why. He did not visit Sinclair Grange for 2 months after the hearing. He sent only documents, all addressed formally, none of them asking for anything. Margot noticed his absence more than she wished to admit, which told her something she spent a good while considering quietly late at night. At the end of those 2 months, she received an invitation to the annual Bellwood Harvest Assembly, 1 year on from the night that had changed everything. Lord Bourne was expected to speak regarding the estate reforms. She considered declining. Then she remembered the assembly hall the previous year, the smiling faces, the pity dressed as joy, the absolute certainty of every person in that room that poverty had already spoken for her. She attended, in a dress she had purchased herself, dark green again. She had always liked green. The hall looked almost unchanged. The same tall windows, the same orchestra gallery, the same floors where Lord Bourne had held out the sapphire ring, as though its value alone ought to answer the question. She chose to stand near the windows. She chose the place deliberately. Lord Bourne spoke from the platform about estate reforms, the accounts, the independent oversight, the dissolution of the structures Croft had exploited. He spoke clearly and without self-congratulation. Then he looked toward the windows. Before this county, he said, I must correct something stated in this hall 1 year ago. The room became still. Miss Margot Sinclair was spoken of, by others and implicitly by my own conduct, as a woman too poor to refuse what she was offered. He paused. She was not. A proposal made powerful by debt is not generosity. Security that removes another person's authority over her own life is not protection. And agreement given because refusal threatens one's home is not freely given. No one moved. He continued, Miss Sinclair refused what the entire assembly had already decided she was obliged to accept. In doing so, she exposed a fraud that had harmed this county for 4 years. Her answer was not foolish. His voice was steady. It was the bravest and most clear-sighted answer given in this hall. He stepped back from the platform. For a moment's silence, then Mr. Dodd began to applaud. Lily joined him, Ada, the mill tenants who had come for the land announcements, and then gradually the whole room, not for a proposal but for a refusal. Margot crossed the floor, every eye followed her. This time no one whispered that she had no choice. Lord Bourne had not moved to meet her. He had left the distance for her to close or not, as she decided. She stopped before him. You said you would ask nothing today, she said. I meant it. Good. She looked at him. This man who had once arranged her future without consulting her, who had stood in the rain admitting he had been afraid, who had set aside his barrister's careful statement and told a courtroom things that damaged him. He was not redeemed. She was not certain that redemption arrived whole in a single moment for anyone. But he was different. And she had enough evidence of that now to trust the difference, or at least to begin. She extended her hand. 1 dance, she said. He looked at her hand, then at her face. There is no orchestra yet. Then you will have to wait. He took her hand carefully, without assumption. When the orchestra began that evening, Margot Sinclair entered the dance because she chose to, not because the debt required it. Not because the county expected a particular ending, not because Lord Everett Bourne had at last become worthy of everything he had once wanted. Only because he had begun learning that love cannot be arranged in advance, leveraged into agreement, or extracted from a woman who has already decided she would rather lose everything than lose herself. Their engagement lasted 6 months. Margot drafted the marriage settlement with her own solicitor and made Lord Bourne read every clause before signing. Sinclair Grange remained under her sole control. The mill income stayed within the sisters' trust. Ada and Lily retained their positions as trustees after the marriage. Lord Bourne requested one addition. If he died before her, Margot would have full authority to continue the Bourne estate reforms without interference. She accepted. They married at the small church near Sinclair Grange. The county had expected grandeur. Margot preferred witnesses who understood the difference between a celebration and a spectacle. The mill receipts, Mr. Dodd's copies, the ones that had started everything, were framed and hung in the Grange's estate office, not as decoration, as a record, so that no future administrator could pretend the account books were simpler than they were, or that the people behind the numbers had not mattered. And the borrowed green dress from the Harvest Assembly. Margot kept it, not because she was particularly sentimental about fabric, but because the let-down hem and the pinned brooch told the story more honestly than any portrait could. A woman stood in a room where everyone had already decided her answer. She gave them a different one. And that answer, spoken without leverage, without rescue, without a single debt standing behind it, was the one that mattered. The Assembly remembered the proposal. History remembered the refusal. And that, my dear friends, is what I wanted to share with you tonight, here beside the fire. That some words cost more than the people around you can imagine and prove worth every penny. That a no spoken freely is worth more than a yes spoken from fear, and that a man who is willing to defend the answer he didn't want is, given sufficient time and honest effort, worth dancing with. I am very glad of your company this evening. If you haven't yet found your way to Moonlight at Bellwood, the subscribe button is there, close as a chair pulled up to the hearth. There are more stories where this one came from. Women who gave the unexpected answer, men who learned something from it, families who found their way through to the other side of a very long winter. Come back soon, friends. The fire is always lit.